So now, without further ado, Marty, I know you're pressed for time. I'd like to introduce both Marty Noe and Jason Stanford. The Honorable Marty Noe represents the citizens of the Coles Magisterial District in Prince William County. He was elected in November of 2003, was chosen by his colleagues on the board to serve as the vice chairman 2007 and again in 2012. Obviously, he's got a passion for transportation and has plenty of transportation experience. He is currently the chairman of the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority, not DOG. He is a member of the Potomac and Rappahannock Transportation Commission and past chairman of the Virginia Railway Express and the chairman of the National Capital Transportation Planning Board. Without further ado, Marty, thank you.
Thank you, Jack. I like when I like the way Jack did the introduction. It makes me sound a lot more powerful and important than I probably really am. I'll tell a quick story. You ran off some of the committees I'm either chair of or been chair of, and I like to tell a story about how several years ago I served 2 years as chairman of the Virginia Association of Planning District Commissions, which you've never heard of, by the way. If you're thinking, oh yeah, no, you don't know what they are. And I come home from the conference where I was elected chairman, and I mentioned to friends, oh, where were you this weekend? Oh, I was down in Virginia Beach. Was elected chairman of the Virginia Association of Planning District Commissions. And my friends were like overwhelmingly impressed. I'm like, no, guys, it's really way less impressive than it sounds. I literally was the guy who said, fine, I'll do it. And that's sort of what happened to me with the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority 11 years ago. Was we were at a difficult time. We had just lost a lawsuit, the outcome of which was that the funding that we had for roads and transit in Northern Virginia was taken away from us by the Virginia Supreme Court because of the way that legislation had been passed by the General Assembly. And there were members of the organization that wanted to just shut us down. And I said, no, and myself along with Scott York, who was a colleague at the time on the NVTA, were saying, no, if you shut down the NVTA now, there will never be another chance. The money's not going to come back if we shut the organization down. We've got to continue to exist. And someone said, well, fine, but I don't want to be in charge of it. I said, fine, I'll be chairman. And I've determined after 11 years as chairman of this board that apparently either I do it extraordinarily well or everyone except me sees it as a genuinely horrible job. And I often fear that it is the second. I would agree with that last year. I think at one point I went to Scott and said, do you want to rotate in his chair? I don't think I got to finish the question before I got the hard no. But anyway, but I got to tell you, it's actually kind of an exciting time for us at the NVTA, and I'll talk about a couple of the things we're doing. And I know a lot of you are familiar with some of the work that we do generally in terms of providing capital funding for roads and transit projects in the region. But now that we're sort of 6 years into this, we've had this funding stream going for almost 6 years. Now that we're 6 years in, we're actually starting to see some real results. It's exciting to be able to say, hey, we got the money for the project. It's exciting to go to the ribbon cutting ceremony, or the groundbreaking ceremony. But what's way more exciting is the ribbon cutting ceremony. And what's more exciting still is having consultants give you information about what the real impacts of those projects are. So just for those of you who aren't familiar, we serve two major purposes of the NVTA. The first of which is we are the planning organization for transportation needs in Northern Virginia. And we do that planning through a document that we call the Transaction Plan. First Transaction Plan was developed, almost 20 years ago. It's called the Transaction 2020 Plan. And it was a document that listed all of the top priorities for transportation in Northern Virginia. The document was about this thick. I mean, it wasn't even like in a 3-ring binder. It was like one of those binders with the little metal tabs to seal things together. We've updated that plan 4 times. Last year, we adopted what we called Transaction 4.0, and we now have a document. Well, the last one from 5 years ago was so thick it was in the biggest binder that they sell at Staples. The most recent plan is so big that we no longer print it. If you want to see it, it's available online. You are welcome to hit Control P and send it to your printer. Make sure you've got extra toner cartridges. It's a really big document. And there's 2 reasons that this planning document's become so big. First of all, we put a lot more analysis into it. Early on, what we largely looked at was, well, we know where the problems are, so what roads do we need to build? It was frankly something of a political document. It was what do the members of the authority think are important. We have transformed that over the course of time to say, well, yes, we know what's important from a political perspective, but we also need to understand why things are important. So there's a lot more analysis that goes into how we decide what a priority might be. The second reason the document's gotten so big is that the problem's gotten worse. There's more things that need to be fixed now. The problem keeps getting worse, literally day by day. My own home county of Prince William County is growing at a rate of 10,000 people a year. Okay, outer suburb, growing by 10,000 people a year. Council of Government projects that by 2045, this region, from a Council of Government's perspective, the region goes from Frederick, Maryland to North Stafford out to Warrenton and out to Charles County. But that region will grow by 1.1 million jobs and 1.4 million people. And if you do the math, then what that means is we're going to have all this population growth, but among them, only 300,000 of the 1.4 million people that are coming here will not be employed people. And when you factor in that some of them are going to be little kids, then what it means is employment as a percentage of the population is also going to go way up. And we have to be prepared to plan for those changes that are coming. So we have this document that guides our decision making. But the other thing we do, and the thing that kind of gets publicity a lot, is that we provide funding for major transportation projects. Over the last several years, it's been through a year-to-year program. Every year we would go through another program where we decide how the money would get spent. But starting last year, we started developing a 6-year plan, the way that the Commonwealth Transportation Board does, that allows us to plan out further into the future and really decide what those bigger projects are that will take several years to develop and therefore which don't need to be funded in a single year. But that transformation from going from year-to-year funding to a 6-year funding program really has already showing a very positive impact on how we invest in transportation in the region. Now, this is a flow chart of how we make decisions. This is not a purely political process. This is not supervisors and city council members sitting around saying, well, I really need this intersection or I can't win the next election. There is a very high level of technical, data-driven analysis that guides us in deciding which of those projects that relieve the most congestion relative to cost. That is the phrase that I have tattooed on my right shoulder, congestion relief relative to cost. And this is the flow chart. And this is actually, I have like this 40-slide deck that we just pull, that Erica does a great job of pulling out the right slides for and putting together shorter presentations. And this is my very favorite one because you can't read it from the audience. So if we're doing it wrong, if we're doing something wrong, you're not going to figure it out from your table. But the point of this is to show that it is a complex process, and it's supposed to be a complex process because we're talking about very large sums of money. Referencing at the table here earlier that I get to live in this very strange world I never thought I'd live in which I get to regularly, almost on a daily basis, talk about things in the context of tens of millions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars. Monica hates it when I tell this joke, but it's not a joke, it's a true story. We were going through one of the programming years one year, and there was a jurisdiction that was just really frustrated over a project that she didn't recommend for funding, and she was trying to make the case for it. And I said to her, and I looked at the project and said, wait a minute, this is only about $14 million. If it's only $14 million, just give them the money. And I lost part of my soul that day because I just said, it's only $14 million. I have no idea how much money $14 million is, actually. I'll never see that in a lifetime. Because of the big dollar amounts we're talking about, it does need to be a very complex and robust process so that we know we're making the right decisions. The authority has adopted, as I mentioned, we've adopted 4 regional funding programs. And through those programs, and it's on the slide here, but this is really important, we have advanced 122 regional multimodal projects totaling over $2 billion. Again, talk about a number that's so big I don't really know what it means. I don't think we ever thought, and many of you in this room were part of the very long, multi-year, almost multi-generational process of trying to get dedicated transportation funding exclusive for Northern Virginia. And looking back at those days before the passage of HB 2313, I don't know that I ever thought I'd be sitting in a conference room talking about the allocation of $2 billion exclusively in Northern Virginia. This is transformative in nature. It's not quite true anymore, but there was a period of time a couple of years ago where we could say that the NVTA had more dollars on the street and more new projects underway than the Commonwealth Transportation Board had in the entire state of Virginia. They finally caught up to us, but I love the fact that the state had to catch up with the rest of Northern Virginia. And part of that is when we adopted that recent 6-year plan, we added 44 new regional projects totaling a little over $1.25 billion. And again, a lot of money, but again, it's $1.25 billion over the 6-year plan. against $2.5 billion worth of funding requests. So the transaction plan I referenced earlier has 342 projects in it. 352 projects in it, valued at $43 billion. So $2.5 billion in funding requests is just a very small fraction of a $43 billion plan that we will probably never be able to fund. I mean, there will never be the ability to fund all of the projects. But if we did, we know that in some areas traffic will be really, really good. And other areas, we will have just prevented it from getting worse at $43 billion. So the need is still very, very high. And the jurisdictions who are our members are working very hard to identify those projects where they can have the most impact for the money. This is just a list of some high-profile projects, and if you can see this, there's almost guaranteed something here that is of interest to you. I think this subset is sort of focused here on this Dulles area, but it includes, we're funding the Innovation Center Metro Rail Station, the Rock Hill Road Bridge, which is a really important project, both for congestion relief and to open up some areas that are going to be important for economic development. The one that hits home for me is Route 28. The most congested section of Route 28 runs through the middle of my magisterial district. And I tell people everywhere I go, I said, we are going to find a way to get improvements to Route 28 between the city of Manassas and I-66, because there will never again be a time when the Coles District Supervisor from Prince William County is also the 11-year chairman of the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority. And this is our only best chance to get this road fixed. But we've got money coming in Fairfax County to widen 28 to 6, and in some cases 8 lanes south of 66. We've got a road widening in up here near the airport between McLaren Road and Dulles Toll Road. We're widening between Dulles Toll Road and Route 50. We've got Loudoun County Parkway projects, Belmont Ridge Road, North Star Boulevard, Dulles West Boulevard widening. These are projects you all know. We are making investments today in these. Now, I wish I could say that by the end of the calendar year, the traffic around the airport is going to be dramatically better. These are big projects, and they're going to take a long time. In fact, and you all, some of your industries, you understand this, we're actually kind of coming up against that point where we've got so many projects on the street that we're now competing against ourselves when we're bidding. And we're starting to see some price inflation, both for materials and for labor and for expertise on a lot of the things we're doing. So it's having an impact on the marketplace. And we'll talk a little bit about that more later. Again, some other, here we got more Route 28 projects, Herndon Parkway, Herndon Metro Rail Station. And we are actually making improvements essentially at various sections along the entire length of Route 28 from the Fauquier County line to the Potomac River. I mean, that's a big deal. This is the road that, you all know this, this is the road that no one wanted to do anything about because it was too hard. It wasn't even that it was too expensive. It's that it was just too hard. And now, because we have the funding and because we have the expertise, we no longer really have the luxury of ignoring it. We now have the opportunity to make some big improvements. This is just a map of some of the projects that we've got. Again, this is just a map of the projects that I just showed you on that other chart. But you can see we've got a lot going on, and you can see a lot of asphalt being poured, a lot of dirt flying up in the air over the next couple years, all in and around this Herndon, Dulles, Reston area because of the investments we're making. Now, talk a little bit about how we get the money. And some of you have seen this before, but there's some important materials in here. So back when HB 2313 was first passed, the authority was receiving revenues from 3 different sources. A 0.7 cent sales tax that applied only in Northern Virginia on every purchase except groceries. 15 cents per $100 of valuation grantor's tax. That's a tax paid by the seller of a home on a home transfer. I have real estate agents point out to me all the time that no matter how you break it down, the buyer of the home is always the person that pays all the fees because they're the only person writing a check. And I then point out to them that, but if you write it this way, it looks like the person who is selling the house is the one paying the tax, and therefore the person who you are taxing is probably moving out of your district and can't vote against you in the next election. This is one that one caused a lot of pain early on. There were a lot of people in the real estate industry, in the home improvement industry, in the home building industry that really struggled with that tax. But it turned out for a while to be a really important source of revenue for us. I think people have gotten accustomed to it. And then a 2% transient occupancy tax, a tax we collect on every hotel stay that happens in the region. And then last year, we had some great news. Well, everyone in the world of transportation in Northern Virginia, except the 19 members of the NVTA, got some great news. We finally got new money for Metro. But where the bulk of that money came from was through the repeal of the grantor's tax and the transient occupancy tax to the NVTA, with those revenue streams being diverted to Metro to pay for the state of good repair projects, which is absolutely a critical project here in the region, but that does pretty dramatically reduce the amount of funding that we have available for new capital projects, be they on the highway or the transit side. And it's absolutely going to have an impact on us, particularly since now almost all of our revenue that we have comes from the sales tax, which is a very robust source of revenue. People will always buy things in Northern Virginia. This will never dry up, but it will fluctuate. There will be times when the economy is bad and the money will be less than we expected. And the other thing, and again, I'm not here to talk about campaign stuff, but an issue I'm talking a lot about in the campaign is what has been demonstrated is that the General Assembly, who 6 years ago was very proud of their willingness to do the difficult decision, raise taxes here in Northern Virginia to get our roads fixed, has now demonstrated that they're willing to come after that money and use it for other priorities. And now all of a sudden my job as chairman becomes a little more difficult and a lot more critical, because there's only a few of us around who can sort of serve as that firewall between the General Assembly and the money that's needed to make some of the improvements that we're talking about. And this is going to be a legislative issue for us for several years to come. Again, talking about the sort of the big pies we've got here. This is, on the left here, is sort of our original estimate of how much funding we were going to have. We were going to have, this is a 19, 20, 21, 22, 23. This was the 6-year plan numbers. We were anticipating $1.3 billion in sales tax, $162 million in transient occupancy tax, $232 million in grantor's tax. We had something on the order of $400 million taken away over the life of that 6-year plan. So way we were going to break that up was we were going to have $1.2 billion that was coming to the authority for the use for regional projects, and then a little over $500 million over 6 years going to the localities, to the cities, counties, and towns for allocation for local transportation projects. You take away a third of the pie, and what you see is a reduction of give me the numbers here.
Close to $400,000.
Close to $400,000 of funds that go away, which includes $120 million that was not even NVTA's money. It was money that was going to go to the cities, counties, and towns. And one of the impacts of that is that Arlington County, whose contribution to NVTA relied so heavily on hotel tax, because they've got like half the hotel beds in the region, they now actually don't receive any share of the 30% money, because 100% of the 30% of the pie that Arlington was supposed to get now has to be dedicated to Metro. So what had become Arlington's primary source of funding local transportation projects is actually now in the red. And they're actually having to find general fund money to prop up their transportation funds just to get to zero local transportation funds. There's a challenge that comes with this. I want to be really clear. Fixing Metro, I don't like to say fixing Metro is the most important thing we need to do in the region. I like to say that finding the money to fix Metro was the most important priority in the region. It's no longer the most important priority because they found the money. Now the top priority has to be making sure the money gets spent wisely, well, and quickly. Because if we put $500 billion toward Metro and the problems don't get fixed soon, I think the public loses faith in the transportation planning community generally very quickly. The other piece to it is we now have to find new sources of revenue to help us address these other capital investment projects that we've identified as top priorities for the region. We did have one small win this year in the General Assembly that I'd like to share with you. Senator Dick Black, who's one of the members of the NVTA, has made a small change. Historically, the local governments were required to pay all the administrative expenses for the NVTA, and we have now legislation that allows us to pay our administrative expenses out of the interest that we collect on the revenues that haven't yet been spent. When a project gets approved, we don't write a big fat check to a jurisdiction and say, go build a road. They submit invoices to us and we reimburse them as the project goes along. But what that means is those revenues are sitting in a bank someplace being regulated by really great minds in finance who are much smarter about this kind of thing than I would ever be, and we're earning return on that money that's sitting still. We can now use that money to pay our administrative expenses. That puts a little bit money back into the pockets of some of the jurisdictions. The other thing that it does for us that's really important is it gives us, the same bill now takes the prioritization process that we use to pick projects that had traditionally been administered by VDOT, moves that over to our responsibility. It's good news for VDOT because it's one less administrative function they have to undertake, but it's actually really good for Northern Virginia as well, because it's one more way in which Northern Virginia policymakers are exclusively in charge of deciding how Northern Virginia revenues are allocated. So that was kind of a big win for us. It felt like an administrative thing, but if you're on the authority, it's really going to have a big impact. There was also a bill that was passed by the Senate and House that's now with the governor to provide some study monies to figure out how to fix I-81. I-81, of course, comes kind of close to Northern Virginia, but doesn't quite enter Northern Virginia. But there's actually where a real opportunity is, because the entire Shenandoah Valley is suddenly a gigantic mega region that needs new money for transportation. And going back to my previous slide about how one of our top priorities now has to be finding replacement revenue for Northern Virginia, probably gives us an opportunity to have a pretty strong negotiating position with those folks downstate who have traditionally said, we don't really care what's going on in Northern Virginia. They're suddenly going to care a great deal when they realize that nearly a third of the members of the General Assembly are from a region that just had a bunch of our money taken away. So we're hopeful that we may have some opportunities with that. Some other big things that are coming up with the NVTA, or other transportation funding things. The one in the middle, to me, is the most important one. In July, we're doing a call for projects, asking for people to request the next round of funds for the FY 24-25 fiscal years, where we believe right now there'll be about an additional $400 million that will become available for us to start relieving congestion. The NVTA will take action on that in June 2020. Don't let it be missed on anybody that means we're voting on it after Prince William, Loudoun, Fairfax, and Arlington counties have their elections, which means that knowing who your representatives at the NVTA are suddenly becomes very important in the context of these November's elections. And if you live in Prince William County, I'd be happy to stick around after and talk to you about how you can have a positive impact on that. Republican Firehouse primary, May 4th, between 10 to 3, voting location near you. But also we've got, we're currently underway with the state funding program, the Smart Scale program, which is it's the third round of sort of the new way that the state allocates funds. They're taking action in June. Now I'll share with you something that some of you may know that's important to recognize. There's good news and bad news with the Smart Scale program. Based on the staff recommendations right now, the good news is that about 25% of the money made available for the entire state for state transportation funding is coming to Northern Virginia. That's the good news. The bad news is that 95% of that big hunk of the pie is going to transit projects inside the Beltway. Prince William County, my home county, is getting $0 in this next round of statewide funding. Loudoun County is getting, Jason, remind me of the number? $1.3 million out of a $400 million program. Prince William and Loudoun, well, let's make it bigger. Prince William, Loudoun, Manassas Park, and Leesburg are collectively getting $1.3 million out of a $400 million funding program. That is of a great concern, not just to those of us in these outer jurisdictions where you have these very large populations with very big congestion problems and are paying a lot of taxes to the state. It feels like to a lot of us that we're sort of back where we were back in the day, where Northern Virginia pays all the taxes but doesn't get the benefit. Now, and I'll say this, and I say this as a high compliment. Colleagues in Arlington, Alexandria, Fairfax, where Fairfax County is getting some funding for a big project, but again, in a more urban part of the county, they agree that this is a challenge. I mean, the interjurisdictions have acknowledged that something doesn't seem right. We've done the math. We know how it happened. They can explain why it happened, but it does sort of call into question this issue of, it looks like it's time to once again start getting very vigilant about making sure that Northern Virginia gets our, quote, fair share, whatever that means, of the statewide pie of funding. So that's an issue we're going to be watching very closely. And then starting this fall, we're going to begin our listening tour for the next update to that regional plan. And that freaks me out because the last one was so much work. So we're going to start asking, and we're going to be out in front of groups like the Committee for Dulles, asking for your feedback on what are the priorities, both in terms of projects, but also in terms of what are your priorities and how we make decisions. What are the factors that should get the most weight when making decisions about transportation? We'll be looking at that over the next couple of years. This is the last thing I'll talk about, and you've got this on your table, and it's a lot of numbers, so I won't get into the details. But we have hired a firm to look at the economic impact of what we do. Now, we're technically not an economic development agency. We are a congestion relieving agency. That said, we said, well, we need to know what the economic impact is. And again, this is on your table, but I think this is amazing. And you can go to our website and get more detail on this. But if you look at the projects we've already approved and what we're looking toward as part of our 6-year plan, when our 6-year plan is fully developed, we will have created 26,000 jobs in the Commonwealth of Virginia, 90% of which are jobs in Northern Virginia. This is not a measure of those companies that didn't lay someone off or move them to a different office because of traffic. This is the jobs created by direct investment. These are engineers and asphalt employees and construction firms and transit operators. These are the jobs that are created just directly through the transportation projects themselves. That's a big number in of itself. In terms of the impact on travel time, and you can attach money to this, but by the time we get to the end of life of our program, so with 2040 is the end of where we're measuring, Monica? The millions of hours saved. So by the projects we funded, or just the projects we've already funded, by 2040, we'll save commuters in Northern Virginia 209 million hours of commute time. That's lifetimes upon lifetimes that Northern Virginians get back so they can be with their family, or they can stay at work if they want. But that'll be time. I'm encouraging everyone in my business to use the time to sell more product for me. But $209 million in saved travel time just with the projects we've already approved. That is estimated to be $3.1 billion in monetary savings to the people of Northern Virginia. And anytime someone says to me, I don't like the idea that I'm paying an additional 70 cents on a $10 purchase at Target, I tell them, our region is going to save $3.1 billion just in saved time. The return on investment on the money we've put into transportation is unbelievable. There's nothing else we can do as a government that gives us this kind of return on investment. All told, between the time savings, the additional investments that are coming, we estimate that our current program, our current 140 projects or so, are going to generate economic activity equivalent to $5.7 billion. And that is truly transformative for our entire region. We are so happy with, this was actually a fairly high-level analysis, but we're so happy with the results, we're going to go back later and get the same consultant to drill in deeper. And the last thing I'll say about this is, I've gotten this question. Sometimes government agencies go consultant shopping, and they want to hire the consultant who is most likely to give them good news. We gave clear direction. That's not what we want. Chimora Economic Analytics is the firm whose reputation is they really know how the numbers work, and they are not afraid to give you bad news. And that there was a pause. There was like, what if it is bad news? We actually didn't think that was possible. But to have probably the folks who are the best in the industry do this kind of analysis, or among the best in the industry, do this kind of analysis and have these kind of results really is very promising for for the region generally, but frankly for our businesses. For those of us who are doing business here, this really speaks well for the future of our economy. Here's all of the different ways you can contact us. And you're not gonna, I don't expect anybody to remember any of those, but just search for the NVTA and make sure that if you want to reach me, you don't email Jason instead, because we have the same initials for our organizations. We're done. So thank you for this time, and again, I'm very excited about the work we're doing here. And the very last thing I'll say to you is this: your presence here at this meeting today is actually very important to the work we're doing. I mentioned earlier the fact that the legislative fight is not over. We're going to be spending a lot of time over the next several years hoping to get some of our money back to the region, and if nothing else, making sure we don't have any more money taken away from this region. We got the success we have because organizations like the Committee for Dulles, and every one of you is a member of a fistful of different sort of trade organizations. We also Washington Airports Task Force, and our Chambers of Commerce, and the Realtors Association, and the Northern Virginia Transportation Alliance. These professional organizations where the corporate world organizes together for the common theme of making sure that Northern Virginia maintains every competitive edge we have is really the only thing we have to push back on attempts to move the success we have in Northern Virginia out to other parts of the state. So I would really strongly encourage every one of you to continue to be engaged here at the Committee for Dulles and the other professional organizations that you're part of, some of which I rattled off, so that we can continue to make sure we get to do this good work. And thank you all very much. And then I actually have to run because we have an MVTA Finance Committee meeting that I'm probably technically almost late for. Monica's laugh tells me I'm almost late for it. So thank you all very much.
For those of you that don't know me, my name's Jason Stanford, and I'm the Executive Director of the Northern Virginia Transportation Alliance. Before we get started today, I always like to get a little informal survey from people who came to the event. Raise your hand if you drove or took some sort of automobile to get here today. All right. Raise your hand if you took some form of transit to get here today. And raise your hand if you took some sort of alternative method like biking, walking, anything. Okay. Well, you're not you're not alone, right? So I always think it's important for us to remember as a region how we travel and get a bigger regional perspective. Our region, 80% of the trips in the entire region are taken via automobile. That's HOV and single occupancy vehicle trips. Does anyone want to hazard a quick guess in terms of how many trips are taken via transit in the region? Anybody? It's around 7%. So 7% of the entire all the trips that we take as a region are taken via transit. And so again, it's about taking that regional perspective. So for those of you that aren't familiar with the Alliance, the Northern Virginia Transportation Alliance, we're the visionary leaders for regional transportation solutions in Northern Virginia. We have a proven record of success. We've been doing this for over 30 years. Every single transportation improvement in Northern Virginia over those last 30 years has come about in large part because of the work that my predecessors, Bob Chase and David Burtwhistle, have done over the years. The Fairfax County Parkway, Prince William Parkway, Loudoun County Parkway, I-66 improvements, I-95 improvements, metro improvements. I could go on, but so much has happened because of the work that they've done. Really moving forward, we're focused on making sure we have new sustainable transportation funding, improved transit options, and increased Potomac River crossing capacity. And our focus, backed by regional thought leaders, many of you in this room, is to build a 21st century transportation network for Northern Virginia. So a 21st century transportation network, what does that look like? For the Alliance, our focus is making sure that we have adequate transportation funding, that we are prioritizing the right projects, the projects that are going to have the biggest impact on Northern Virginia. For the Alliance, that is making sure that we reduce congestion and improve travel times. The less time that you spend getting from point A to point B is more time that you have to do the things you want to do, whether that is, spending time at work, spending time with your family, or just, having fun. So that's really where we get the increased economic prosperity and improved quality of life. So as we go on today, I'm just going to talk a little bit more about that regional perspective that we started off with. So this chart right here is a breakdown of what as I mentioned earlier, what the trips will be, not now, but in 2045. So you can see the blue there is a single occupancy vehicle, the orange is HOV, the green is walking or biking, and the purple is transit trips. That's if we build everything that is currently in the plan to be built between now and 2045. That is the number of trips that are going to be taking place throughout our entire region. Additionally, you can break that down. The first bar here is the region's core, that's DC, Arlington, Alexandria. The second one here is the inner suburbs, and then the third bar there's the outer suburbs. So you can see most of the trips are taking in the inner suburbs, but you can also see how the modes change, whereas in the region's core, there's more walking, biking, transit trips. As you get further out, becomes more and more dependent on cars and automobiles. So if this is the mode breakdown, how much money are we actually going to spend as a region on transportation the next 25 years? Well, that's right here, $100 billion. And I know Marty was talking about, having to deal in millions. We're talking about $100 billion over the next 25 years. And then also on transit, we're going to spend around $191 billion. As you can see, the vast majority of that is just the operations and operating costs of our current transit system. The dark red and the dark blue are the money. It's around 20% that we're actually going to spend on expanding the capacity of our transportation network. So when we do that, what does that end up doing for our region? Well, the estimates, making all the investments that we're looking at making, we're only going to be increasing the total vehicle hours of delay in the region by 46%. And then we're also only going to be increasing the congested roads in our region by 3%. So even if we do everything that we need to do to try to help improve transportation in our region, I think it's also really important to remember that doing all of those things is just enough, as Marty said, to keep things from trying to get worse, right? That if we do nothing, that's where the blue lines come in. And if we do everything that we have on the plans, then that's where the green lines, that's where we try to keep things from getting much worse. So what are the things that we can do to try to help improve regional transportation and mobility in Northern Virginia? So the Alliance, as a nonprofit advocacy group, we are focused on major regional transportation improvements, big improvements, things that are going to have a big impact for our region. So for us, we are focused on the first two projects here, expanding the American Legion Bridge and completing the I-495, I-270 Express Lane network. For those of you that might have heard in the news, those two projects are really tied together and very focused in Maryland. Building a new Potomac River crossing north of the American Legion Bridge, increasing capacity on the Long Bridge, which is the rail bridge between DC and Virginia, and then reforming and reauthorizing Metro, making sure that we have enough funding to keep Metro going, and then finally creating sustainable transportation funding. Marty talked a lot about the authority and their funding issues, and I'm not going to delve into those today because I think he covered those pretty well, but I will delve a little bit more into the smart scale issue that Marty talked about for our region. So the American Legion Bridge, so as those of you can see there on the picture on the right, is just an average Thursday in the Washington region. The arrow there is the American Legion Bridge. It's one of the worst bottlenecks for our entire region. Maryland is currently proposing a traffic relief plan to expand capacity there, 2 express lanes in each direction. It would relieve traffic congestion, provide actual reliability right now, because right now if you have to get across the American Legion Bridge, there's no chance for you to even pay for a trip or get a reliable trip. You never know what's going to happen. If we have reliability that could be created by the express lanes network, then you would be able to enhance transit service and actually have a transit vehicle that could cross over the bridge. You're going to increase safety. The bridge is over 50 years old. We're going to have to do something about this bridge in the next 30 years. And so Maryland it's become really their top priority. And then also it's a national security issue as well. It's the only bridge between the Chain Bridge in Arlington and the Point of Rocks Bridge up in Loudoun County. It's really important that we make sure that bridge is safe and stable. So this ties into the I-495, I-270 project. You can see the picture here. The governor in Maryland is currently going through an environmental impact statement, and at the same time has also put forward a P3 request. They are considering screened alternatives. They started with 15 different alternatives for this project. They've screened it down now to around 7. That includes the no-build option. But there's really going to be 3 phases. Phase 1 is going to be the American Legion Bridge all the way to I-95. That project is going to be the first one that it's going to be built, and the one that we're really pushing forward to move forward with right now. The second phase is going to be up 270 and then also 495 to Maryland 5. And then the third phase is going to be 270 all the way up to Frederick, Maryland, and then the last section between Maryland 5 and the Woodrow Wilson Bridge. Virginia is also doing its part to help make this critical connection. Because this last section here, the governor just announced a deal a few months ago with Transurban who is going to complete the last section between where the express lanes end on 495 all the way up to the American Legion Bridge. This really is going to help make a huge connection for our region because it's going to provide seamless connectivity so that if you're using the express lanes in Virginia, you'll be able to go right across the American Legion Bridge without creating a different problem. And that's going to allow us to expand capacity, more carpool trips, and more transit trips as well between Maryland and Virginia. So the third priority I'm just going to talk about a little bit real quick. A lot of you know the Alliance has long been the advocate for another bridge crossing between Loudoun County and Montgomery County here in the region. This project has been on the books for a very, very long time, but it's really important because if you see this map here, the darker the red, the more jobs that would be created in our region by building this bridge. If the region's Transportation Planning Board studied this bridge and found that this one project would reduce delays regionally for our entire area by 3%. That's 100,000 trips a day. Around 50,000 of those trips would come off of the American Legion Bridge, and another 15,000 would come off of the Point of Rocks Bridge. Right now, it would reduce that connection and then provide connectivity, and also, again, it's a national security issue as well, creating some redundancy in our system. God forbid something ever happened to the American Legion Bridge, then our region would be in it, have a lot of problems. So it's really an important connection to make, and the Alliance is focused on working with our regional partners and regional stakeholders. I think the first project that we just talked about presents a great opportunity for us to build support around improvements in Maryland that ultimately could help us move forward with this project. The Long Bridge. So the Long Bridge, pictured to the left, is the giant piece of rust that you see there going over the river. It was built over 100 years ago. It carries, if you take Amtrak from Virginia or anywhere on the East Coast, between Virginia and DC, you get to cross this bridge and take your life into your own hands. This project would actually add another bridge next to the Long Bridge to expand capacity that would be dedicated to rail. It's currently at 98% capacity during the peak hours. And as a result, Virginia and VRE actually has to take Virginia Railway Express trains, bring them into DC in the morning, then pay to park them in DC, and then bring them back out again in the afternoon because there's not enough capacity to run them both directions. So right now they're doing an environmental assessment that's going to be ready later this year. That study was funded through the Atlantic Gateway project, but now the actual construction of the bridge is going to be $1.3 to $1.6 billion, and there's not currently a funding source identified for that yet. This is definitely one of the top priorities for the Alliance and also the Virginia Department of Rail and Public Transportation, and it would really allow us to expand VRE service into areas of Fairfax County, Prince William County. And when we're looking at what's the best way to improve this service in other parts of the region, if we look at the cost it would take to do something, say, like expand Metro versus the cost to build this bridge, it actually puts it in perspective to say this is a much more cost-effective, cost-efficient way to improve service in places like Prince William and Fairfax County. So the next set of priorities that we're going to talk about today real quick is, it really falls more into priorities, less about projects, but I think it's also really important for our region. Everybody knows how important Metro is, and that, as Marty pointed out, we dedicated $500 million as a region, $150 million from Virginia for Metro. The Alliance is a part of the Metro Now coalition, but unfortunately a huge chunk of that money is money that we diverted from the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority and took away from their ability to fund important projects in our region. Right now, at the federal level, there's a 10-year authorization, $150 million a year, that is also matched by Virginia, Maryland, and DC. So that's $300 million for Metro that we need to reauthorize that runs out this year if no action is taken. this presents a great opportunity for us to not just give Metro the funding that it needs, but to make sure that it's actually spent efficiently and wisely by implementing governance reforms. Reforms like talking about an inspector general, improving accountability, looking at the jurisdictional veto, looking at the number of people who are on the Metro board, trying to take the partisan and parochial politics out of it and actually have some financial oversight and make sure that the decisions that are being made are taking in account the long-term sustainability and viability of the system. You're going to probably hear a lot about this in the next few weeks because my understanding there's going to be a bill filed soon. And the Metro Now Coalition, the Alliance, and many organizations throughout the region are going to be talking about this issue a lot more in the coming weeks. So the last issue that I wanted to talk with you about is the sustainable transportation funding, which I think is another really important issue for our region. At the Alliance's event in October, we had Secretary Shannon Valentine was our keynote speaker. And one of the quotes from her speech that really stuck with me was the fact that we can't keep funding a 21st century transportation network with 20th century funding mechanisms. What is Secretary Valentine talking about? Well, she's talking about in large part, the gas tax, right? As vehicles become more fuel efficient, as we transition to more electric vehicles, you can see somewhere in the middle there, it's about where we are now, that the gas tax actually flattens out as a source of revenue, while at the same time, vehicle miles traveled, the amount that people are driving in our region is continuing to rise. We've seen the effects of this, as Marty was talking about earlier, in Smart Scale, and I'm going to dive into that in just a second. But we started out with $1.4 billion in the first round of Smart Scale. The second round, we had $1 billion, and the third round, we had $780 million. So the funding to expand the capacity of our transportation network is going down. However, I also think it's important to put it in context. You can see there the motor fuels tax is actually the third largest source of revenue for transportation. The issue is that it stays flat versus the motor vehicle sales and use tax and the state sales and use tax, which is actually those revenue sources are going up. So Smart Scale. Marty talked a little bit about this. Right now, as he said, we do fund this in a 6-year plan. So when we talk about Prince William County getting no money and Loudoun County getting very little money, I think it's also important to remember we're talking about money for projects that isn't coming through until 2024, 2025. It's 6 years from now. So, if we don't get money now for these projects, then it's going to be a long time before things start to move forward again. Smart Scale is the way that we prioritize transportation projects throughout the state. It's supposed to try to give us more of an apples-to-apples comparison of different projects. Every project receives a benefit score, and then that benefit score is divided by the requested amount of money. Then that's how you get your Smart Scale score. As I said, there's only $780 million. That was for $7 billion in requests statewide. So I think that just underlies the point that it's very clear we need more funding for transportation throughout the Commonwealth. $390 million, or half of that, goes towards the district grant program, which is divided not evenly, but distributed to different planning districts so that every part of the state does get some money for Smart Scale. And then the High Priorities Project program is where they're actually competing throughout the state for statewide money. So Smart Scale. So we have 5 different categories that we use across the state: congestion mitigation, environmental quality, accessibility, safety, and economic development. You can see here the land use category. That category only applies to Northern Virginia, Hampton Roads, Richmond, some of the more urban areas. And Northern Virginia and Hampton Roads are the only area where it's 20%, or the second highest scoring category for the entire region. Then also here we have a chart I would point your attention to give you a sense of how these different categories are broken down and create what is a total benefit score for a project. So we have 2 projects. One is the Pickett Trail Connector. It's a 420-yard trail connection in the city of Fairfax. And then we also have I-95, a southbound auxiliary lane, which is an additional lane on one of the most heavily used highways in the East Coast. If you look at Smart Scale and those scores, you can see that the Pickett Trail Connector has a total benefit score of 4, while the I-95 southbound project has a total benefit score of 7. To give that an additional perspective, the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel scored 74. That was the highest scoring project this year. Of the 440 projects that were submitted through Smart Scale, 420 of them have a score between 0 and 10 on this 0 to 100 scale. So all of them are being distilled, all of these things are being added up and distilled down into very small scores, which you can see is a problem when we actually divide it by the cost of the project. So if this is a 4 and this is a 7, but one's 23 million and one's 6 million, it sounds really good to say we're getting the biggest bang for our buck, but when we have a system that really makes all of these projects kind of look equal, all we're really doing is funding the least expensive projects. Another point too, as you can see on there, the blue section, the one that makes up the biggest portion of the score for the trail project, is the land use category. And then the one that makes up the biggest score for the I-95 project is congestion mitigation. If you look at the most recent round of Smart Scale, Marty talked about this too, Northern Virginia, $199 million. This is the staff recommendation, and the Commonwealth Transportation Board does still need to adopt it. But you can see there by locality, how many millions of dollars went to each locality in Northern Virginia. The $50 million for Fairfax County was the Route 1 BRT project. If you actually look at the scores, the Route 1 BRT project, there were 2 projects that actually scored higher than that project, but it was one that got recommended for staff funding. And then you can see Loudoun and Prince William down there at the bottom. And then on the right, the breakdown between transit, highways, and pedestrian and bike improvements. You can see 88% of the funding was for transit improvements in the region. So what's going on? What's the big problem here that we're looking at? So the Alliance has identified sort of 3 big issues. The first one is accurate measurement, right? All of the different categories that we talked about are all weighted against the highest scoring project in a category. So the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel scored a perfect 100 on congestion mitigation, and then every other project is weighted against it, so that the second highest scoring project for congestion mitigation got a 12. So you have a 100 to 12, that huge range. Now every project, the congestion for every project, the factor that's supposed to be the biggest one according to the General Assembly for our region, all of those are now depressed and much smaller and have a less of a weight compared to the other categories that we talked about. Issue number 2, the land use category. Again, that's a category, it's really, the way that we calculate it is in a way that directly benefits areas that tend to be more dense, right? Areas where they multiply, they take the job and the population density, they multiply it by the walkability to non-work destinations. Well, if you look at what areas those are areas that are already dense, already have a lot of walkability. Those are going to get a higher score under the land use category. And then the final one that I talked a little bit about is the cost-benefit analysis, because really what we're doing by distilling all of these different scores down to a 0 to 100 scale, and really the vast majority of the projects getting a score between 0 and 10, then when we divide it by the cost to get the final Smart Scale score, small projects with small benefits are outweighing big projects with big benefits. A few things that we're going to be looking at for Smart Scale, things like removing outliers like the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel, trying to weight projects against a second highest scoring project or one that falls within a standard deviation of all the different projects. Ensuring that we actually are weighting projects properly so that congestion mitigation really is the most important factor here in Northern Virginia. Reevaluating the benefit of the land use category so that if the goal is to make sure that we're actually trying to encourage more dense development, then we should calculate it that way. We shouldn't calculate it based on how things are now at this time. And then also making sure that we could look at funding the projects with the highest benefit scores. If all of the scores are going to be distilled down to a 0 to 10 range for 420 of the 440 projects submitted, then why are we dividing them by these huge cost numbers? Why don't we just take the ones that produce the biggest benefits for the region? And then finally, they haven't voted yet. So the Commonwealth Transportation Board actually has to adopt this 6-year plan. We have 2 members here from Northern Virginia, one from Arlington, Mary Hines, and one from Middleburg, Scott Kasperwitz. They're our voice on the Commonwealth Transportation Board, and there's still an opportunity for us to talk with them about these issues, and they don't have to accept the staff recommended projects. So moving forward, and just to talk a little bit about the Alliance, we're a nonprofit organization. We're supported by organizations like the Committee for Dulles. If you are interested in the work that we do and talking about transportation for our region, which is extremely important, as you can see, about all the different things that we're working on right now, you can become a member of the Alliance. You can support organizations like the Committee for Dulles that help support the Alliance. You can follow us on social media, on our website. We have a lot of information about any kind of transportation improvements going on in the region. And then you can also join our mailing list for updates and alerts and breaking news and event invites as well. So thank you so much for your time today. I'm happy to take any questions about this issue or anything that happened in the General Assembly this year.
Well, on behalf of the committee, I just want to say thank you.
Thank you so much.